that no one ever asked me is why. Why do you ride freight trains? Instead, I usually end up answering the same questions. Yes, people still do that. No, I won't take you with me next time. But the one thing that no one ever asked me is why. It all started illegally. Graffiti broke up with the monotony of suburban life. I started to go to the train yards, and more, they began to feel like art galleries. They were constantly bringing in new work and replacing the old, and I never knew what I was going to see. The works of my favorite artists would roll into town, and I was able to see it free of charge. And in no other art gallery could I walk up and touch any piece of art that I wanted to. And despite the regular close encounters with the authorities, the train yard began to feel beautiful and safe. I began to feel like I was becoming a part of something. And like any other loving relationship, the closer I looked, the more beauty I found. I started to realize that I was falling in love in the most dirty and dangerous place in town. Then one day, I was walking down the line and I saw a bird drawn on the side of an oil tanker. It was a hobo's moniker, and as time went by, I started to see more and more monikers, and I started to understand the culture of the railroad that truly existed beyond my imagination. I thought the American hobo was a thing of the past, but there I was, staring at the marks of a hidden culture. I saw it emulating the visions of previous generations, and it turns out that it had been surviving as it always had, on industry and adventure. The image I had of a hobo was the slanderous vision of movies and television, but the men and women who ride the rails are steeped in as much culture and history as the railroad itself, and they've been there through its every evolution. The railroad shaped our country in ways that we couldn't have imagined. We built railroads and tunnels and bridges and dams, and it opened up not just the West, but our world. The mail could flow, and goods could travel from coast to coast in record time. We built towns to sustain the railroads that in turn sustained the miners, farmers, and businessmen of America. Fortunes were made and stolen from the same railroads we use today that carry the materials to make theaters and seats and stages. The American hobo built his legacy in much the same way. He worked hard, but only when he needed money that he otherwise cared little for. Instead, he decided to spend his time watching the world pass by in good company, visiting new places, and living simply. I'd been distant from so many other manifestations of happiness that it became easy to forget that comfort wasn't what I needed to measure success. I began to see success as a measure of my happiness, and I began to feel like a failure. Then one day, I decided to chase what I felt I was missing. I dug my heart out of the pit of my stomach and left alone in the middle of the night with only my pack, my camera, and some water, scared to death of what I was getting myself into, but even more afraid to turn back. Soon, the train started moving, and we passed through the same trackside neighborhoods that I had painted my graffiti in for so many years. Then, the lights of the city began to fade into the desert sky. I saw the stars come out and looked around the dirty boxcar and began to feel successful. There were days where all I did was wait for my train to come. But there were days where I watched the sunset behind the mountains in New Mexico, and all I saw around me in every direction were wildflowers of every color stretching to the horizon. Then, there were also days where I watched the mountains roll by in front of my dirty feet, and the world seemed to become so big all around me, but I must have grown right along with it because it all seemed to come right to my fingertips. Every direction I turned was new, and every direction was beautiful. I'd long since forgotten about clean clothes or showers by the time I got to Oregon and had to return to Phoenix. I had met amazing people that were all living simply and happily, and I was moved and inspired by all the captured sights and stories. It wasn't until I returned from that first trip that I was able to see just how discontent I was before I left. My life had gone from half full to half empty to drained, and I had no idea what I was missing until I'd gone out there and tried something new because there was no other way for me to experience it. It was all difficult and scary, but I grew up in the most supportive family with the best mother any kid could ask for. And I was told that I could do whatever I wanted to do and go wherever I wanted to go. And I lived to test that and found it to be true. Since that first trip, my life has become a relationship with the road, which is all that it will ever be. Some days it works, some days it's hard. Some days you don't want to go home, and other days you sleep on a couch. But I love it and miss it, and it will always be there for me. To answer one final question, I don't get lost. I'll be lost when I begin to feel that my happiness is a place on a map. I'll be lost when I think that I've seen it all. One day, I am sure I'll be lost, but until then, you can find me in love. Thank you.